with us. And I'm Heather Balas with the Election Reformers Network. And to the roughly 150 people that are in this meeting, we just want to thank you so much for making time in your busy schedules to join us for this national launch of the Election Overtime Project. That's a collection of legal and policy tools to support journalists, specifically in covering close, contested, and disputed elections. So for today's presentation, as you can see from the agenda that's on your screen, we have a lineup of really terrific folks that are going to give us some a start on how we're going to think about some activities related to election coverage. And important for you all to know, this lineup includes Republicans, Democrats, and independents who probably disagree mightily on many things as it relates to policy. But if they're on this panel, they do agree around the importance of our commitment to trusted elections in America. And so each of these speakers are part of the Election Overtime Speakers Bureau, and they'll be presenting briefly today with an expectation that you all can call on them in the future. And this is the first of what will be roughly a dozen media briefings over the course of the election, running all the way through Inauguration Day if needed. So we're going to get it started today, and then we will proceed with more information for you all in coming months. So as I mentioned, I'm Heather Balas, and rather than talk too much more about me, I just want to lift up the entire Election Reformers Network team along with our partners who come to you today in an absolute spirit of service and collaboration. We, like so many of you, wake up every day thinking about the future of our nation and the continuation of trusted elections in our democratic republic. We believe that sound news media in America is the most crucial factor in helping that happen. And so with humility, we offer our support to the hardworking election reporters of this nation. And here's what some of that support looks like. In particular, we have these resources that are available on the Election Overtime website. We're going to preview some of them today. Some of them are available now, and then some of them, such as the litigation tracker, will only become available after the election once we see which states do in fact find themselves with races that are in the courts. Today, you're meeting a number of members of our Speakers Bureau. This is the first of the media briefings that we're talking about on the screen. But we importantly have these state-specific policy briefs. And that's going to be a principal focus of what we're talking with you about today, and one of the ways that we hope that you all will utilize these services. We consider this, our team, our little Valentine to the hardworking and committed election reporters of our nation. And what we did was we interviewed reporters to see what is the information you will most likely need. And we know that if you are a journalist on a filing deadline, you don't have time to go through a 400-page election policy manual to try to figure out the answer to your question. So we did our best to do a bunch of that work for you. We took the 400+ pages of procedures, manuals, regs, and statutes for each of our targeted states, boiled that down to a roughly 25-page report that is then boiled down further into an easy-to-read single screen for all of you. And we did that across all 4 states. And while we're not going to do the thing where you have to look at the whole website with this, we're going to trust you to click in and play with it yourself. I want to just illustrate for you what one state looks like, in which the questions are sandwiched nicely, and then you do an instant little pull down. Let's use this one as an example. Every reporter I know is at some point having to cover security and accuracy of the voting equipment, and we're giving you per state detailed information on how to start to answer those questions, along with extensive citation so that you can fact check our work along the way. And so, having said all of that, I am going to pause. Oh, and I want to also just quickly do a shout out to two people that are out in the big room, Rachel Levin and Mike Parsons, who with Kevin Johnson and I were the authors of these briefs that I just mentioned, and they worked tirelessly to try to get all of that right for you all. So having said all of that, I'm going to turn things over to my boss, Kevin Johnson, who's the executive director and founder of the Election Reformers Network. He's been a long-standing champion of electoral reform, both in our country and internationally. And he's got a fair amount of interesting things to say as we start this conversation.
Thank you, Heather. We have a great audience and a great panel, and I am super proud of the Election Overtime Project and super excited about it. The information that Heather just described is organized around these three pillars, which we think of as the pillars that support the trustworthiness of close and contested elections. The first is transparency, which refers to the ways that the procedures that create visibility for voters. And particularly importantly, visibility for parties and candidates so they can see what's going on with the election. The second, I was going to say, what I used to do overseas election observation work, whether or not the parties had their observers in the polling station was one of the first things we checked for because it created that transparency. The second pillar is verification of election results. Every state has rules and guidelines that require checking and rechecking of results to make sure they're accurate. In many cases, those are done with party involvement, either observing or actually involved in the process itself. The third pillar is what I also often call judicial review. In our country, candidates and parties have the right to challenge the results. That's fundamental to democracy. Courts are human. They're a human institution. They don't always get it right, but this is the best institution we have in our country to hear evidence and render judgment. And one of the things that we believe that grounds this program is that it would be great if the media paid more attention to the rulings of courts of law and less attention to the ruminations of the courts of public opinion. Each of these pillars involves not just election officials, but contestants themselves. And that's a really critical point. The participants have agency in our elections. This is not the Vatican where everyone stands outside and waits to see if white smoke emerges. Participants have agency, they're part of the process, and voters need to understand that better. I now get to talk about, I want to switch over, next slide, please. I get to talk about the sports metaphor underlying this program because Heather Balas, despite all of her great talents, doesn't speak sports. And so as folks know, games go into overtime, and I happen to, being from Massachusetts, happen to want to put this score up here. And some people hate this picture, including some who are on this panel. Some people like me love it, but no one disputes that that's the outcome. No one left that stadium debating that maybe it was actually the Falcons who won. And one of the reasons for that is that people really understand the rules. There are 1 million 9-year-olds in the United States that know that every touchdown scored in an NFL football game is reviewed before it really counts. And that's why it says play under review on the screen here. Wouldn't it be great if we could get American voters to understand the rules of election overtime just as well as 9-year-old sports fans understand the rules of football overtime? That's one of the things we're trying to do here. And media who are on this event, you can be the commentators that can build that understanding. I'm going to continue on. If you could advance to the next slide. A quick kind of preview of some information that we're going to share very soon that goes to this question of how well do voters know the rules. We did a survey. We'll be releasing it in about a week. That's a sneak peek at the results. People don't know the rules that they should, and that misunderstanding is even on both sides, politically and in terms of media source. Stay tuned for more on that. Over to you, Heather.
Very good. So before I introduce our next speaker, Rashad Mahmood, I do want to let the audience know that you have a screen on your side that lets you post questions that you'd like to offer to the panelists. Feel free to be posting those questions throughout the discussion today. We'll take them all at the end, but we're going to be accepting the questions along the way. And so having said that, let me just welcome Rashad Mahmood, who is a former print, online, and radio journalist and the executive director of the New Mexico Local News Fund. He's part of the National Democracy Fund and Press Forward initiatives, helped us pilot this project 2 years ago, and like several other people on this call, has both international and domestic election-related experience. So Rashad, take it away.
Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm honored to be a part of this. Yeah, this initiative in part really was a sort of a bottom-up grassroots effort that Heather and I worked on in New Mexico. We were both part of a local committee working on fostering a stronger democracy here in New Mexico. And we realized that a resource like this would be incredibly valuable for the journalists in New Mexico that really have a lot on their plate. And when there's an unknown situation that comes up in journalism, especially around elections, it's hard to find the time and the resources and the experts. And so having this sort of framework all ready to go is going to be incredibly valuable for journalists everywhere, not just in these swing states, hopefully, but even in other places. One example that I think really sort of highlights this issue was in New Mexico in 2022, we had a county commission that refused to certify the election results. It wasn't based in law. It wasn't based on any suspicion of wrongdoing. It was purely a political decision, essentially. And I think overall, the media in New Mexico did a pretty good job of covering it. But it was so really like out of left field. If you had asked people ahead of the election, what are some of the problems that you're likely to see? A county commission refusing to certify a legal election was not on people's bingo card. And so I think that's why having these resources available ahead of time is so important. I think really our job as journalists, it's easy to sometimes do a quick story, interview two sources on opposing sides of an issue, report what they said. But ultimately, as journalists, we need to be devoted to the truth and to helping people understand the underlying dynamics and laws and ground truth of what's really going on. And so we need to really go beyond just what people say and be familiar with the law, be familiar with the processes involved, so that frankly, if someone's just blowing smoke and not being accurate in what they say, we need to be comfortable calling that out with a detailed knowledge of what's really going on the ground. So yeah, I'm just really looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panel and looking forward to answering any questions later on that might come up.
Very good. Thanks so much, Rashad. I appreciate that. I would like to, as we tee up Jason Carter of the Carter Center, who's going to come next, I just wanted to quickly share with folks a little bit of data that's particularly worrisome to a lot of us. This was released just last week, and this is a survey that was put in the field on the 18th of this month. 58% of Americans, of registered voters in this poll, fear that political unrest will likely increase in coming years. And furthermore, for the election that we're looking at right now, fear that the threat of political violence is very real, no matter who wins. And so it's the no matter who wins piece that is a real reminder for people that are doing work in this space. And so to that, given that sort of haunting context here, I would like to welcome Jason Carter to join our conversation as co-chair of the Carter Center. Jason is also a former Georgia state senator, candidate for governor, and as the grandson of President Jimmy Carter, comes from a family with a history of service to our nation and service across the globe to sound and trusted elections. So Jason, what do you want to add to this conversation?
Yeah, thank you so much, Heather. I greatly appreciate being able to be here. And the Carter Center over the last 4 decades really pioneered and then has executed election observation missions over 110 different elections in over 40 countries. And so we've done a lot of this internationally and looked at situations that run the gamut from very significant political violence situations. For example, in Liberia, and when I was there in 1997, it was literally at the end, unfortunately, in the middle of a civil war, but there was an election there among, frankly, actual warring parties. That was a part of a peace process. We've seen elections, again, in a variety of different contexts, but what we have seen is we have seen also when the press works, and when talking about the elections in advance really helps to drive home and educate people about how this operates, and dramatically reduces the risks of political violence, and increases the ability for everyone to sort of respect those outcomes. And that overtime period, to Kevin's point, although sitting here in Atlanta, it was a remarkably painful analogy to see, having lived through that particular Super Bowl. But it is real. And I think that as we talk about these issues, just to give a quick example, in 2020, I led the mission, the Carter Center's mission to observe the election in Guyana, which is, as many of you know, a small country in South America that exploded onto the international scene because for about a 4-year period, it led the world in new oil and gas finds. And so this election was incredibly consequential for the people participating, incredibly polarized electorate, and it ended up taking months and months and months for that result to be properly counted, certified, and have credibility. And during that process, there was a remarkable set of patients, a remarkable reservoir of patients, and frankly, faith in that rule of law that Ben Ginsberg is going to talk about when I'm finished, as understanding and believing that these separate institutions have legitimacy. So one of the things that we've done as we've looked internationally and then turned toward the US in the last several years is begin to talk about what are these principles that underlie trusted elections? What are the fundamental small d democratic principles that give people faith in the system? And so we've put them here, and we have put them out as candidate principles and others, but you can see that you're talking about an honest process where people are telling the truth. Obviously, the media is a fundamental part of making sure that occurs. The nonviolent campaign is straightforward, but it requires both not inciting, but also denouncing any of that violence, making sure that people are communicating with their supporters to keep calm, do the right thing. The secure voting is something that has already been discussed. Responsible oversight and trusted outcomes are two things that are also crucially important and probably define most what the press can do. And to us in this overtime period, one of the most important things I think for people to know is, number one, we're not going to know on election day who wins, right? And just knowing that the expectation that the election is over on Tuesday night is not a real expectation. And as we cover that, it's crucially important to know that this overtime period is coming. And then number two, I think it's crucially important to know that you don't have just an election irregularity or an election that is imperfect or something that happens that you heard. As we've observed elections across the world, every single time, the stories of things that have gone wrong travel like wildfire. And the question is, how do we sort that out? And the answer, and this is why we're passing this baton here to Ben Ginsberg, the answer is we spend a lot of time in this overtime period sorting through what happened to make sure that the election still has credibility or not. That trusted outcome requires the rule of law, and it requires that we talk about and expose those election irregularities and then identify which ones are truly rise to the level of one that might impact the outcome of the election. So those are the types of principles that we've worked on in many, many democracies. We're excited to be here. Obviously, we care about this democracy enormously, and I'm honored to be here and happy to answer questions later.
It's great. Thank you so much. Jason, what is one thing that I was supposed to add? I was supposed to add one more slide back here, and Jason, I'm sorry, I didn't do it, that had the website so that people on this call who choose to endorse the Principles for Trusted Elections can do that. And for the record, that website is principlesfortrustedelections.org, and voters, election officials, public officials, and candidates in particular can sign on to that. So Jason, sorry, I forgot to give you one more slide.
Thanks, Heather. I'm glad you took care.
All good. Hey, so next up, we're going to hear from Ben Ginsberg, and we're just so tickled to have Ben on this panel. He's represented 4 of the last 6 presidential nominees in one way or another, and as an attorney. He's also the author of Lost Not Stolen, which we're going to hear more about. He's a leading researcher in terms of legal researcher in terms of how we think about what's happening in election processes, and is a strong advocate for rule of law in our country. So Ben, up to you, sir.
Heather, thank you. And thanks to the Election Reformers Network for having me and for putting on this really excellent panel. As reporters, you are going to be exposed to an avalanche of litigation around this election, both before and after. And so the rule of law is going to play an absolutely crucial role. Of course, the role of the rule of law is bigger if the election is closer in a given state. And really, as we saw in 2020, sometimes the rule of law comes into play, even if the results are not so close. But the rule of law, what the courts do, and whether the litigants who ask the courts for judgment live up to their part of the bargain and accept the rulings and the proceedings they've entered, matters a lot. For this year, you know that there have already been a slew of cases, over 100, filed in many states, but particularly in the 7 battleground states. And what those cases are is really a roadmap to the issues that stand to come up post-election. So as a reporter, trying to gauge what's happened before and will happen after, note that most of the cases filed do not ask for injunctive relief. They don't ask for a remedy before the election. They are by and large placeholders for actions that can be filed post-election. So the actual cases fall into a number of categories. The failure to maintain voter rolls so that ineligible persons are able to cast ballots. It may be through false registrations, people who've moved out of state continuing to vote in the state they've really left, dead voters on the roll, and of course, non-citizen voting. There will be questions raised, as there have been pre-election, about mail and absentee voting, about the failure to more properly maintain voter rolls, about mail ballots arriving after Election Day, and of course, the certification process. And those stand to be the issues that you should concentrate the most. There's also a side issue on whether ballots are properly counted, not so much on the races themselves, but as happened in Georgia, a reconciliation between the number of pieces of ballots that exist and the number that the machines ran through to see if that was somehow inaccurate. When you look at what is likely to take place in 2024, if it's a close election in the state, the report that Heather referenced, Lost Not Stolen, is really a handy reference guide. What it does is look through the lens of 8 conservative jurists, 3 retired federal appellate court judges, former Solicitor General of the United States, a couple of election lawyers, a couple of wily political operatives for Republican campaigns, and looks at all 64 cases that were filed in 2020, which are similar to the issues that have already been raised in the pre-election litigation for this year. And what we concluded is that the charges that were brought by Donald Trump and his supporters, all 64 cases, lost because of a lack of evidence, not because there were procedural deficiencies in the cases or judges didn't want to hear them. 30 of the 64 cases were dismissed after merits hearings. 14 were voluntarily dismissed by the Trump supporters who brought the cases, and 20 were dismissed for a lack of evidence before a hearing on the merits. So what's important, I think, in 2024 is to beware of the rhetoric. That in fact, a campaign and a party that loses a close election is going to find reasons to file cases. In fact, it happened in 2016. Jill Stein filed recount cases in 3 key states. The Clinton campaign joined with Jill Stein late in November of 2016, so that contesting through the rule of law election cases is part of the process. But the key as a reporter is demanding evidence for the allegations that are made in court. And that's what you need to be asking repeatedly, is what's the hard, solid evidence? Now, in 2024, both parties will have many people in each of the polling places that are relevant in this country to a tight election. And so those poll watchers, the Republican National Committee has claimed they'll have 175,000 poll watchers, should either find evidence that needs to be corrected in the election system, or if they don't find that hard evidence in court cases, it is evidence that there is no evidence to cause the results of the election to be taken into doubt. So I would just urge you to really make reporting evidence-based and to demand from the litigants the real proof of any fraudulent voting or false ballots that are filed. With that, there are ample resources. What ERN has put out is really good materials. There are other groups who are also out there to help you. And the best thing you can do is to actually get to know the election officials like Kim Wyman in her former life who will follow me. But it is the election officials on the state level and especially the key counties who are really the most knowledgeable sources for being able to debunk false information. So with that, Heather, thank you so much for having me, and good luck to all reporters this cycle.
Very good. Thank you, Ben. Ben made a comment around the role of observation, and I just want to give you a heads up. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later in the briefing, and also referenced the fact that there are other organizations out there that are also making earnest attempts to provide solid resources for journalists and others that are following the election closely. On the resource tab of the electionovertime.org website, there are links to as many of those other organizations as we can find, including several that people on this panel are involved in. So check that out when you've got a second. Now, what I'd like to do is welcome this really brilliant woman, Kim Wyman, to the panel. Kim is the former Secretary of State for the state of Washington and has for more than 30 years been working in election administration at both state and local levels. We are really proud of the fact that she, like so many people on this panel, works across party lines in a very constructive way, predicated on helping people understand in a very fact-based way how elections work, and is set up to help reporters on this call understand a little bit about how to understand when things are working and maybe when they're not. So, Kim, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Heather, and thank you, Election Reformers Network, for taking the time to do this, especially with the chance to follow Ben Ginsberg. That's always a high bar. All right. Well, first, what I want to kind of lead with is this is a time where it's really easy to believe, and hype up some of the things that we know are happening in elections, like election turnover. So I just want to get on your radar a report that the Bipartisan Policy Center did recently about election turnover, election official turnover, looking across the country. And while there is an uptick since 2020, realize this is part of a larger trend that goes back really to the 2000 election. And it isn't just a localized or temporary problem. It is one that we're, really taking a long, hard look at and trying to think about with that long view. But there's some good news, I think, going into the 2024 election. First is that election officials are well prepared and have been planning for this election for the last 4 years. And they're ready to conduct this presidential election. And while the turnover was higher in 2022, we know that 65% of local election officials have experience running a presidential election, and that the new election officials have an average of 8 years previous experience, either within the office they're taking over or the one they've moved to. And that figure jumps to 11%, or excuse me, 11 years in large jurisdictions. So even where new officials might not have ample experience, the training is there to fill the gaps. And 43 states have training programs to do that. The second thing I wanted to talk about is really realize that mistakes in elections are going to happen. And that's, excuse me, you know what? I jumped I apologize. Let me go back. Actually, I was on track. Mistakes in elections do happen, but don't always believe the rhetoric that there was bad intent behind them, and that's why they happened. And realize that both parties do this. And I think Ben did a really good job of summing that up, because one side will scream fraud, the other side will scream suppression when a mistake happens. So I want to give you the context that in elections, there's really 3 main periods that are happening. The first one is the planning period. And in this country, that started about 4 years ago for this upcoming election. And the laws and the rules have been established by state legislatures, and we're ready to go. And election officials have been working for the last 180 days or so to get ready for this election, at the least, with trainings and tabletop exercises and trying to anticipate what can and will happen. And that leads right into what we're in currently, the voting period. It officially began for most voters on Saturday with the cutoff and the requirement to send to military and overseas voters absentee ballots. And early voting has started in some states, and mail-in voting is also starting in some states. So election officials are now really shifting their focus to preparing for the end of the voting period, or election day, and in-person voting. So I want to remind you with my third bullet that results have never been final on election night. Not at least in the 30 years that I've been doing this work, and that hasn't changed. Certification is the next period, that canvas period that we're really entering into after election day. And the people that call races are media outlets. It's all of those of you on this call. So remember that in this period, this is where election officials are working to reconcile those paper ballots, and 97% of voters will vote on a paper ballot that they can verify in this upcoming election. And so that canvas period is when election officials are really working to make sure that all of the ballots that were counted were counted accurately. And this is going to be a period of time where errors might surface. Realize that can happen in any of those periods I talked about, but it leads me to my fourth bullet: is how do you know when it's an error and when it's something more serious? They're all serious. I would say first, take your lead from election officials. They are very good about transparency, and when things go wrong, they want to share it with you. Ask the tough questions, but don't always leap to or buy into the narrative that this is somehow a nefarious act. Many times the errors are just simple human errors, like or something that happens like Sharpie Gate, where people make it out to be more than it is. But reach out to them to understand the mechanics, as I think Ben just said, early. Do it now. Start understanding how the elections work in the jurisdictions you'll cover. And then, like I said, ask the tough questions, but try to understand what happened before you leap to the assumption it was fraud or suppression. And with that, I'll stop and turn it back to Heather.
Thank you so much, Kim. I noticed in the Q&A that's coming in from the big room, we do have a question about whether there will be access to election officials in each of the swing states. So alas, Kim Wyman is not one of our swing state public officials, but we do have a growing list of qualified people who can present similar kinds of information to what Kim just shared with us. And a couple of those individuals are already posted to the election overtime state, and I believe we're going to have identified election individuals for at least the state level election officials, and in several cases, county-based election officials. Believe we'll have those names available for you all on the website probably by the end of this week. So the answer to Morris Efren's question is almost, and we'll have the rest by the end of the week. So thank you for that question. Next up, we are going to shift to one of the other pieces that's come up in this conversation, which is the matter of observation and the ways in which we can have confidence in electoral procedures, because it's not just election officials in the room following the work, but we also have independent observers, observers that take a whole host of different roles. I'm tickled to be on the panel with Carmen López, whom I have known for many years and have a great deal of respect for, and want to point out that she has a long-standing career that's around supporting a representative and accessible democracy. She is a national expert on election protection matters and is currently running a nonpartisan election observation initiative here in our country. So I'm going to turn over to Carmen to talk a little bit more about what we need to know about election observation, what it is and what it isn't.
Great. Thank you, Heather. And thank you to the Election Reformers Network. So I'll just start by saying that election observation occurs in every state in this country and in hundreds of countries around the world. So in the US, election observations conducted by representatives of political parties such as Democrats, Republicans, or Libertarians. They're appointed as observers or challengers. They have legal standing in states to watch the process on behalf of registered voters with their party. These representatives are empowered to varying degrees to advocate on behalf of voters from their party with election officials. That is the most common form of observation in every state in the country. Less common, but still important, is nonpartisan organizations that are watching the process itself for general adherence to law and standard practice. And their legal standing varies from state to state. So the Carter Center has begun to conduct election monitoring in the US during the past few years, and they're doing so in New Mexico and to a more limited extent in Montana and in Georgia. New Mexico is the only state that I know of that provides legal standing for nonpartisan election observation. Most states neither prohibit it or allow it. There are also a number of nonpartisan election-related organizations such as Common Cause, the League of Women Voters, and others that watch particular parts of the process. So they often lack legal standing, and they observe the public parts of the process, such as an election board certifying the wording on the final ballot, or certifying the results of the election, or observing outside of polling places to watch for adherence with voter intimidation and electioneering laws. There are also a number of organizations that serve particular constituencies, watching the process on behalf of their constituents, such as disability rights organizations, watching for adherence with federal or state laws that protect the right of blind or deaf or physically disabled individuals to vote, or organizations that serve incarcerated people who are observing the voting process in jails in Michigan, Washington, Massachusetts, Colorado, Texas, and probably 15 other states. They're watching for adherence, and then the last group I wanted to mention are civil rights organizations that are watching for adherence to federal language access requirements, such as providing ballots to certain language minority groups or translators for speakers of non-written languages. These folks also often have legal standing to advocate directly with election officials in polling places. And internationally, nonpartisan election observation occurs in hundreds of countries and is conducted by the Carter Center, for example, and then also government-sanctioned organizations such as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I think that election, if you want to switch to the next slide, I think election observation matters in every one of these countries because it educates the citizens about the election process. It increases transparency, and if the election is even reasonably well run, it increases trust in elections. It provides journalists and thus the public with a wide variety of vantage points from which to view election processes and experiences. And research indicates that international election observation, specifically the presence of nonpartisan or independent observers, reduces fraud, it encourages participation, and it boosts confidence in the election. And I want to say just a bit about what nonpartisan election observation is, because it is not as common in the US. It is becoming more common, but it is not the most common type of observation. And I also want to address why observers are important to journalists and to the public. So individuals observe election processes in order to determine the level of transparency and adherence to law and/or election standards. Observers adhere to principles of non-interference, fact-based intervention, and reporting, and their attention is on process, it's not on the outcome of the election. Nonpartisan observation is distinct from partisan observation or constituency-based observation, which is common and legally protected in most states. Partisan and constituency-based observation occurs by design so that observers can ensure that their voters receive fair and/or legal treatment, and they may be empowered to advocate or intervene with election staff on behalf of their voters. The impartial process where trained observers systematically gather data about an election in order to assess key aspects of the process and report on the degree to which the election was fair, peaceful, and credible. Nonpartisan election is grounded by facts and evidence, and it validates the critical work that's being done on the front lines of our democracy. So when you look at the broader picture of what's happening with election observation, it gives you a much better sense of how to engage with those folks to get stories about what's working and not working. So there are many election observers, and their job is to find problems, identify them, report on them, and advocate for people. But that is not the entire system. So I hope that that's helpful in giving you a little bit of sense about what observation looks like and how you can utilize your relationships with these folks and talk about the stories that there are to talk about in the election.
Thank you, Carmen. I appreciate you providing that context. And for those of you that are thinking about what questions you might want to offer when we go to Q&A in just a couple minutes, Carmen has done election observation in multiple states and in pretty complicated environments, including prison observation, I think in Michigan. So might be a chance to talk a little bit more about that if people are interested. Next up, we're going to get a quick update from Ari Middleman from Keep Our Republic about some resources that he has for journalists and other folks that are doing work in the election monitoring space. Importantly, Ari is another of the individuals on this call who has experience both domestically and internationally in terms of doing election and peace-based work. And his organization has the unique mission of focusing on the unconventional threats facing our election system and trying to get ahead on those. So we're really grateful that Ari is with us today.
Thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate you and the team convening this. In the 2004 election, which seems like 5 decades ago, I was working in the former Yugoslavia. I've spent extensive amount of time in the former Yugoslavia, and I just mentioned that because even back in 2004, before smartphones, the whole world was watching. And just earlier today was speaking with Japanese journalists on a ride back from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And so the whole world is watching. So I really appreciate you convening this. Our organization is entirely focused actually on the post-election period. I love this term, election overtime. I won't comment on the Patriots, but the focus of the organization is also on the state of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Cannot speak about the other states. We also would encourage journalists on this call really not to look at these states through just one lens. In a place like Pennsylvania, for example, it's important to recognize that it's a Commonwealth. Some counties have a home rule charter, some counties do not. We can go more into that in questions. It's important to understand that in each of these states and across our country, the distinction at the appellate levels of the state court system and then when the federal court system might intervene. We are completely dependent and blessed by the volunteers. The names and faces that folks see on our website are not just names and faces. We have former federal judges and state judges, former U.S. attorneys, and former elected officials and other experts who really can get not only granular about what might be happening in Northwest Wisconsin, for example, but also some of the personalities that have written rulings as recently as just last week with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. What's profiled on the screen, I'll end with this. We do occasionally dabble outside of these 3 states. We shouldn't lose sight that December 11th, all governors across this country need to sign what's called a certificate of ascertainment. So our organization, led by 2 bipartisan former governors, one from Pennsylvania, one from Michigan, who are super active with us, they had reached out and alerted nearly 24 former governors to sign an open letter to the nation's governors that went out last week. So we can certainly talk more about the certificate of ascertainment and other terms like that just roll right off your tongue, but hopefully the whole world might not be familiar with, but might be familiar with in the middle of December.
Fair enough. Thank you, Ari. I appreciate all of that context. And when Ari mentions those certificates of ascertainment that we're going to be talking about later, that is one of the topics of the upcoming election overtime briefs. So we'll be doing a whole briefing on how to understand what's happening as it relates to the final counting of electoral votes that will conclude the presidential election. So that's something to see coming down the road. But our last presenter before we go to Q&A is David Nevins, who is another journalist on our panel and is the co-publisher of the Fulcrum. If you don't already subscribe to a daily update from the Fulcrum and you want to follow election policy matters, I do recommend this publication. David has provided a whole host of resources that are available for this program and for reporters that are going to be covering election matters. So, David.
Well, thank you all. I'll be quick because I know there are a lot of important questions out there. I am the co-publisher of the Fulcrum, a daily news publication, and also chairman of the board and founder of the Bridge Alliance with over 100 nonpartisan democracy reform organizations as our members. And I can speak to the fact that while just about all of them, who I've known for 10 years roughly, are focused on the long term, something different is happening now. And they are very focused and very concerned about the narrative out there and the potential distrust of the elections in the coming months. And they all understand the importance of journalists getting the story right in the coming months. And they're hopeful that through the work of the Election Overtime Project and through whatever contribution the Fulcrum can make, we can make sure that citizens across the country are getting the information correctly. And we stand ready at the Fulcrum. We're a daily publication. We reach about 400,000 readers a month, but more important than that, we get many, many more readers because a lot of our content is picked up by local newspapers around the country. So when false narratives arise and as information occurs and as situations occur and are adjudicated in the courts, we stand ready along with the Election Overtime Project team to provide correct information for our readers and for readers in local newspapers around the country. So in addition to making our information available to all the journalists on this call and others around the country, if any journalists on this call want to contact me directly and have their content published in the Fulcrum, I think by cross-publishing information, we can amplify and scale the work of this Election Overtime Project. It's critical that we get the word out. And we also have an extensive Facebook social media following of 930 followers, and we will be posting all the content about the election overtime process on the social media as well as in the Fulcrum. And hopefully through this entire process and an understanding of how important the facts are, many, many local newspapers around the country who already pick up our content will be particularly focused on doing so in this critical time. So thank you all, and I appreciate everybody's efforts to make sure that the facts are told correctly to the American public. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, David. So as I mentioned, this is the first of a series of briefings. These are just the ones that are leading up to the election. Among the questions that are offered by the audience, Jennifer Roberts is asking about rapid response that's going post-election through inauguration. And our commitment is to be available to support rapid response for reporters and other voter educators during that period of time. And what we will be doing is expanding this list of upcoming events once we know specifically what the needs are. So we're not planning events in states that may not have trouble. We're waiting to see where we have, if everything goes smoothly, maybe we don't have too many more briefings. But if the need requires, we are equipped to be holding more briefings like this all the way through Inauguration Day. And with that, we're going to turn to some of the rest of our questions. And in particular, I'm going to ask people who have offered questions already in the chat, if you're willing to share them out loud, raise your hand over in the big room so that we can find you and bring you over on the moderator side so that everybody in both rooms can hear you. But the first one that we saw was Jennifer's. We've gotten that one addressed. I think that Zev has a useful question. Zev Braun has a useful question regarding partisan observers. Zev, do you want to ask your question live? And then Carmen, I think that one's going to go to you.
Sure. Yeah, I was going off Carmen's presentation. I was just interested whether partisan observers representing a party are allowed to look at or record the names of voters who cast their ballots at a polling place, or if that information is generally kept confidential. Just wondering about potential for voter harassment depending on the kind of motivations of those observers.
Well, it's not uncommon for people to do exit polls on the outside of polling places, and they can record voters' names there. I would actually defer to Kim about the law in Washington, and I suspect that the law differs across states.
Absolutely. It does differ across states. So each state is going to have its own laws. But remember, the broader context of building confidence is having a transparent process. So when you participate in an election, it is a public record that you voted, not how you voted, but that you voted. So on election day, if you go back 20 years ago when we were voting at the polls for every election, that was a big part of political strategies, was having people observing the election in the polling places, taking down names and going and making sure those voters showed up and voted. So yes, I believe in most states that this is a public process and that people can see those lists. And intimidation is probably legal in most states. So they have to be very careful about that. I will just add.
Thank you, Kim and Carmen. We've got a really interesting question from David Levine in the chat. And David, I wonder if you want to come off mute and ask yours live. And if so, we'll give you a second to get it moved into the big room. I didn't give you a heads up that this was coming, so you didn't know to raise your hand so that it'd be easy for our host to be able to switch you in here. Okay, well, oh wait, do we got him? Yep, we do. David, floor is yours. Just unmute, sir.
Sure. Heather, can you hear me?
We sure can, thanks.
Sure. No, I was just, I don't know if you saw the question in the chat. I wanted to ask, for those states, there are a few where there were some laws that were passed to restrict a little bit more, right? Mail voting, early voting, perhaps add some requirements to ID. And some of those changes were perhaps fueled by some false allegations out of the 2020 election. How reporters should go about trying, particularly in those sort of closely contested states, figuring out whether those kinds of changes could perhaps right, tip the outcome. I know that there was a story recently written about this, and I think I was sort of asking for reporters who may be trying to cover that, how they can go about doing this in as responsible a way as possible.
Who wants to take that idea of how to cover something as complicated as that in as a responsible way as possible?
Well, I'm happy to take a first shot at it. I mean,
Great.
the rubber meets the road in the turnout figures. So you will have an initial indication on really the pre-voting, how many people are voting early and how that compares historically in a state, and what the turnout is like on election day. And then as the results become better known, you can look at specific precincts for any impact that might have had if your suspicions are that it was particularly targeted. I think you need to be really careful about the rhetoric and the reality in this situation. For example, and I know Jason will have views on this, in Georgia in 2022, there was a law that was described as very restrictive against voters. Yet turnout in the 2022 Georgia midterm was higher than it was in the 2018 midterms. So that a lot of the hysterical rhetoric, including Jim Crow 2.0 allegations, were refuted by what actually happened on election day. For an academic piece, there's really an excellent one written by Justin Grimmer, a political scientist at Stanford, and Eitan Hirsch, a political scientist at Brandeis, showing that the actual sorts of laws that were passed had only a marginal impact on turnout and results. And that is largely because as these laws are passed, the political parties adjust their get out the vote mechanisms to be able to sort of compensate for what they perceived as the impacts of the laws.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben. Jason Carter, do you want to add to that?
Sure, just briefly, and first of all, I essentially agree with what Ben just said. I think there's two things that are crucial. We can talk about voting issues in a particular state, but be careful in a state like Georgia if you make things more restrictive, which I would say there's no reason to do that, right? I think you can say there's intent behind a law that says we're going to make it harder for people to vote. But at the end of the day, in a place like Georgia, it is significantly easier to vote here than it is to vote, for example, in Connecticut or in Pennsylvania or in any number of other places, right? And so I think comparing and putting it in context is really, really important to be responsible in advance of the election. And then ultimately, to Ben's point, you can't really determine, quote, is this going to impact the outcome until after the election, right? Because we don't know what this election is going to be like. And I think that everybody wants to cover and everybody gets clicks from covering the horse race because I think my people are going to be impacted by it. But we've just got to be careful that what we're doing, and this is true for Democrats, right? I'm a Democrat in Georgia. I have run for office, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in this state. And in 2022, my state elected a Republican governor and a Democratic senator, right? I mean, it is much easier for everybody to have some faith in the system when there's an outcome like that. But regardless, I just think it's important to keep it in context and then to really follow what Ben said, which is the impact of these laws is almost always going to be negligible because we are always going to be able to deal with it. Now, if there is some significant problem, there's going to be challenged in court and it's going to be challenged in advance of the election. And we're going to be able to make the arguments that we want to make there. And that's where I would stay rather than in the world of speculation.
Got it. Thank you so much, Jason. Carmen, you want to make a quick additional comment on this one? And then we're going to turn to one more before we close.
I do. To directly answer your question, I think it depends on how surgical and strategic the changes are in elections, whether or not it matters in terms of the results. There's a long history of intentional disenfranchisement of people of color in this country. I could speak about any about a number of very specific groups. My expertise is in jail-based voting. And so I can say that very specifically that pretrial detainees in jails in most of the country have the legal ability to vote, and yet they lack the actual ability to vote. There is a long history in Oklahoma, New Mexico, and a number of other states of disallowing Native American voters to vote, primarily by putting obstacles in their way, such as not allowing people to vote with post office boxes, or not having a precinct within 3 or 4 hours of their home, or only allowing people to vote who have a USPS verified address. So there are a number of obstacles that are real for voters across the country. So I would say that the answer to your question is it depends on how surgical and strategic the voting curtailments are in a particular area. And that you're probably well positioned to determine, whether that means something important in terms of the outcome.
So thank you, Carmen. So what we know is that there's different circumstances in different parts of the country, different ease of access in different parts of the country. Carmen and I both live in a state that is home to 23 tribes and pueblos. So the idea that you're 3 hours from a polling place is not an insignificant matter here. And that's very different than in a lot of parts of the country, including Georgia and others. So we've got lots of different examples, lots of different circumstances, depending upon the environment that people find themselves in. There are a couple of additional questions in the chat, which we're going to send answers out to people on via email after this event. And we are going to close in just a second, but I'm going to turn things to my colleague, Kevin Johnson, for just a quick sec before we wrap things up.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say 2 things. Am I freezing? No, I want to quickly say 2 things. First of all, as Heather showed, we have upcoming events in several states. We have fantastic speakers, just like we've heard today. We have former Supreme Court justices, state Supreme Court justices, former governors, former secretaries of state in the different states from both sides. So it's a great lineup. Check out the events on our webpage. And then I also want to say, Heather may echo this, but just because I'm feeling it, I just want to particularly highlight 2 people who've been right behind us in this program. David Nevins of the Fulcrum stepped up early on, recognized the strength of this idea, has been a partner, a thinking partner, and a financial supporter of this. So huge thanks to you, David. And Jason Carter, the Carter Center, has also given a grant to support this, and we are grateful. We've just loved the opportunity to work with the Carter Center for years now, and to take the next step in working together with this program has been really wonderful. Over to you, Heather, for the next bit of the closeout.
Great. In addition to the 2 sponsors that Kevin just mentioned, this program is also supported by the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and we're grateful for that. And we are going to wrap this up with a few parting remarks for all of you. The resources that we've talked about today, again, are at electionovertime.org. All of the speakers on today's panel are available as part of our broad speakers bureaus our speakers bureau to support reporters across the nation as you're doing the very difficult job of covering this election. Not only are these folks available to you, but as Kevin mentioned, we've got specific experts in each of the swing states that are part of the project. So lean into us as much as we can help you out. We will. There's also on that website an opportunity for you to join an email list and get updates on the project. But also, if you're a reporter on deadline, there's a specific form where you can fill that out and say, I'm on deadline. This is what I need and when I need it by. We're going to do everything we can to help you out when you're in that situation. So with that, thank you to our audience for hanging with us. We're only 3 minutes over. Sorry about that, but not too bad considering the richness of this lineup. And especially thank you to all of our speakers for the important content you've shared. And more importantly, the spirit of service that I know that we're all bringing to this work. So many thanks. We will talk to you soon. Have a great day.